So thank you, Madhava, for joining me today. Um, you're a fairly new friend, um, but one that I have deep and profound respect for. I've had the gift of being able to stay at your home and spend time with your beautiful family, and so I feel a heartfelt connection with you. Um, Again, deep respect for your work and your mind, where you put your attention. And so, as a result of that, I had invited you to be a speaker for an event that we held at the end of May at Rutgers.
Hmm.
And so, what I wanted to bring to whomever gets to watch our conversation together, I wanted to just bring your perspective into what's been going on in the last 18 months based on your background. And then I thought we would talk as well about some of the discoveries that you have made and what you've been focusing on, putting your attention on over these last 12 months or so. I thought that would be the direction that we go in our conversation, if that
It's
works.
I, I think it'll be worthwhile. Yes.
Yeah, so Madhava, so you're an engineer by background, and then you returned to school as a mature age student to go to medical school. Can you just start with a little bit of a background for the people who don't know you, haven't come in contact with your story?
Yes. I was trained as an electrical engineer, and when I was in my early 20s, I worked on the space station program in the aerospace industry out in California for a year, and then I was recruited to work for a research and development firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Bolt, Beranek and Newman, who they were really the experts in the field of acoustics originally, but did a lot of other defense work, military funded kind of stuff. And eventually, I found myself part of a research expedition up to the Arctic. We were trying to use the available technology to solve um, a very difficult problem when it comes to protecting the country, which is the following. Um, we are very, very good at being able to track submarines under the water. However,
Hmm.
not when they're under ice. And so the threat, if you will, from the Soviet Union at the time was we would know when their nuclear subs left port, we'd track them, and then every nuclear sub, the captain would go straight to the North Pole. Why? Because once you go under the ice, you no longer can be tracked. And so anyway, the technology really was about like if we could track what happens to submarines under the ice cap, we would have a tactical advantage over our enemies, if you will. So that's the nature of the research, but that ended up being a revelatory moment in my life because at the end of this incredible adventure for a 26-year-old to be, camped on a sheet of ice about 160 miles from the North Pole uh, in the middle of spring, and then disassemble our entire encampment. And what I realized was, holy moly, like, what am I doing with my life? Like, I'm trying to, learn about surveillance. I feel like my entire education and what talents I have was being used for a purpose that didn't really resonate with my higher purpose.
Mm.
So as soon as I returned from the Arctic, I started the preliminary steps to going to medical school. Uh, so
Had you been
that's what I
thinking about going to medical school? What was
no, I
the
never thought about it.
inspiration for that?
Well, look, I followed the same path as many healers and physicians from time immemorial. What can we do to help humanity?
Okay.
And medicine obviously is possibly the most direct method of alleviating suffering. So it's slightly stereotypical, right? But I would have to say that most physicians come into medical school, or most medical students come into medical school right out of college. They did the preliminary work, and they start medical school. That's been their lifelong dream. And there was only a handful of people in my graduating class that had careers before, and it was interesting to recognize how different our perspective was on Western medicine, allopathic medicine, um, because from the very, very beginning of my training, the first thing I understood was, holy moly, if we are to regard the human body as a machine, which is what allopathic medicine does, it's incredibly designed, or it is incredible. Let me just put it that way without getting into philosophical, uh, mm, problems. It's beautifully constructed, if you will. Um, so many, it's so resilient and fragile at the same time. But the reality is that compared to engineering, we have very little understanding of what is really, really going on. I had a mentor tell me once before. He said, "Look, Madhava, if you're doing bench science, like as a physicist or a chemist, you need to have incredible precision. Like we're measuring things that are just fractions of grams and you know things like that. You have to be very precise if you want to do that kind of research. If you want to do engineering, you don't have to be as precise. You just have to get within a thousandth of an inch, when you're measuring things, and then they have to fit together with certain tolerances. So you don't have to be as precise as physics or chemistry. In medicine, we're just trying to get the sign right. What does that mean? That means we're just trying to make sure we're not doing any harm. We don't even, like, we have an understanding that this is probably going to work, but in order to demonstrate efficacy, what do? We have to take a huge number of people, subject them to our experiment, use a placebo, and hope to measure some difference in terms of efficacy between the medicine that we're giving and the placebo. So it's a valuable and admirable intention, but we also should acknowledge the fact that we're just kind of guessing here. We don't know the answer until we actually do the trial, which is much different than other elements of science, where we can say with a certain amount of confidence that it's going to work out this way. So that I believe has offered me a different perspective on Western medicine. I see it as an approximation with good intent, but it's also deeply rooted in the unknown. For example, Andrea, I'll give you this example, right? So, like as an anesthesiologist, I
Right.
can give you a medicine like fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid, right? If I give you 100 micrograms of fentanyl, your experience is going to change perceptibly and significantly for a short, 12 to 18 minutes of time. 100 micrograms, we're talking 100 millionths of a gram that I administer into, let's say, you're a very slender young woman, at 55 kilograms, so 55,000 grams. Like, we're talking an order of magnitude of nine. The point here is that when such tiny little, um, the introduction of such tiny amounts of things can change your experience completely. This is an indirect way of demonstrating that we're messing with something that is so wonderfully attuned. When I give you, something that weighs 1 billionth of your physical structure, and your experience changes completely. You know, that's sort of what I'm alluding to here when we're talking about the precision and the delicacy of the instrument that we call our human bodies.
Mm. And so, what motivated you to become an anesthesiologist? Because, as you're saying, it seems that, especially with a specialty like that, precision is required, would be a required course because you're holding somebody's life, their breath, in your hands.
Yes, well, you sound like someone who's been anesthetized before,
I have, yes,
Well,
one time.
you don't have to go into that. That would be a violation of HIPAA. But the point is that many people don't understand what anesthesiologists do, and you're right. We are responsible for chaperoning someone from a state like we're in right now of complete awareness into a place that is about as close to death as you can get
Right,
to without dying, and then bringing them back safely while the surgeon is able to operate on them. So, in reality, this is the most amazing thing, in my opinion, that Western medicine has been able to offer humanity is anesthesia. Um, for that very reason, because if it wasn't for anesthesia, this like every surgery we do would be brutal, right? It
right.
would be
Yeah, it'd be
just like we
traumatic.
did the Civil War.
Right.
Hold someone down, give them a piece of leather to bite on, take a shot of whiskey, and then start sawing off a limb or something. It would be absolutely what's the word, ancient. But because of the advent of modern anesthesia, everything becomes more humane. Everything becomes amazing, and this seems like a segue into anesthesia itself, which is it's one of the oldest forms of medicine that we use. Like
Okay.
anesthetic gases, 175, 177 years in the we use it in practice. We don't know how it works, and we don't, which is
So you don't know
totally
how
astounding.
you've got the chemistry, right? There's a cocktail, right? And so you're saying that you don't know how it's working as it interacts with the biology. Is that what you're saying when you say you don't know how it
Well,
works?
that is a very a precise and educated way of expressing it. So well done. And the reason why I want to say that is when we claim that we know how something works in medicine, what does that mean when you say we understand? What we mean to say is that we have identified all of the molecules in a pathway that are involved in a certain process,
Mm-hmm.
including the medicine that we have administered. And we say that the molecule of the medicine, it looks like this. It interacts with a receptor on your
Right.
cell, this, and then there's secondary messaging that create a change in the cellular metabolism that gives us our result. When we have identified all of that pathway, we as medical scientists say, we know how it works. We got it. We understand it. With regard to anesthesia, and first of all, there are many kinds of medicines we use as anesthesiologists. Here I'm referring to anesthetic gases. This is the first gas that was demonstrated to be of profound importance, like it was called ether. And what's really interesting about anesthetic gases is that they're very simple. They're tiny, tiny molecules. They're hydrocarbons with a couple of halogens, like that means fluoride or chlorine, and you breathe them in. And comparatively, like you take any other kind of medicine, a synthetic pharmaceutical, they're incredibly complicated molecules, huge. Why is it that we cannot understand or we don't know what the molecular pathway that ether uses to make us unconscious? It's a very uh, it's the age old question. Like when I was a resident 22 years ago in anesthesia, the first day I was in the operating room, my mentor said, "So Madhava, you see that dial that you're turning here, where we turn up the gas and turn down the gas? You figure out how that works, you'll win the Nobel Prize."
Oh.
Right away we're like, "Wow, really? We don't know how it works?" And we say that. We say that today.
Hmm.
And my mentor was told the same thing when he was a resident 30, 40 years prior. It's a mystery. So this leads to a very important question, which is why don't we know how it works? Um, and here's where we have to get a little more contemplative. The first thing we can say is that we actually know that the gases affect our body. In fact, they affect so much of our body that we have no idea what part of it relates to awareness. Like, why does awareness get shut off when you're breathing an anesthetic gas? Um, and if you are trying to find the molecular pathway, which leads to unconsciousness, you're stuck. Why? Because it affects so many different things. Like, not just one, cell. It affects the lipid bilayer of all your cells. It affects the transcription of DNA. It affects the transmission of nerve signals. Everything seems to be affected by anesthetic gases. So we can say then that, oh, maybe awareness has to do with our entire physical structure. However, another wrinkle appears, which is if you look at functional MRI scans or when you look at brain activity in someone who's aware, you will see that in everyone who's aware, there are certain parts of your brain that are active.
When you say aware, you mean awake?
Yeah,
Like beta consciousness?
beta consciousness, conversant, aware, like
Categorizing, criticizing. Yeah.
yes,
Okay, awake.
being
Yeah.
able, like all of those things, or just being able to respond to a question.
Okay.
However we want to do it. Certain parts of your brain are noted to be active in
Mm-hmm.
people who are aware, and they're not active in people who are not aware. Very, very simple. But now, if we look at that more closely and say, okay, so let's identify these parts of your brain that are active when you're aware. So what are you saying now? That's the aware part, and the rest of your body is not aware? Who are you exactly? Are you just those particular parts of your brainstem that happen to be active and the rest of you is not you? So we start running into a very big problem, which is that means that some of us is aware, some part of us is aware and some part of it isn't. And how would you identify with some part of you that is never aware? No, I mean we're this entire structure. We have this multi-sensorial experience. How can you possibly attribute it to just a few nerves or a few pathways? So this is where anesthesia is very interesting to me um, because it opens the door to more questions.
Mm-hmm.
And here's more and more wrinkles start appearing the more you start challenging our paradigm of Western medicine. And Western medicine itself is based on this particular axiom, which is everything comes from matter, molecules interacting with each other, right? Including our awareness. It has to be born of molecular interactions. That is the allopathic model of
Hmm.
medicine. Yet, with anesthesia, we say, well, you're saying that just some molecules interacting with each other gives rise to this experience? That doesn't seem possible to me.
Right.
Because then, who are we? Are we just those molecules? We're not. So it makes more sense then to recognize these identified pathways as a as the sign that awareness is present in the body. Now we start running into real problems when you start saying things like that in my field, right? Because now I'm challenging the idea that you need a functioning body to be who you are or to be aware.
Mm.
We don't like to talk about things like that because our job as physicians is to make sure this physical structure remains intact.
Do
But what if
just a quick question. Do other anesthesiologists also meet with a philosophical uh, part of themselves? Do they, just through the volition of the work and through the natural tendency of human beings to question and be curious, do they find themselves asking the important spiritual philosophical questions of, what am I? How does consciousness work? How does all of this work? Are you a minority, do you think, or is it just a path to enlightenment in a way?
uh, I'm definitely the minority.
Hmm.
I have yet to meet another anesthesiologist that thinks
Wow.
about things this way. Um, so the philosophical aspects of medicine are not easily grasped. And I would say that in for most physicians, it's you don't really have to ask these questions. But you would think that an anesthesiologist or an anesthetist that uses these gases all the time would at one day stop and say, "Wait a minute, what exactly is going on here?
Right.
How does this work, and why don't we know?" So, um, again, I feel like I'm a black sheep in my field, and I don't know why that is. I don't know why people are not more curious. And
Well, you just must have more of a philosophical mind, an inquiring mind or the seeker archetype that opens these inquiries up for you,
mm-hmm,
that has you interfacing with reality from that perspective, right?
mm-hmm.
Um,
It's a philosophical mind, but here's the other thing that this may lead into another interesting aspect to our conversation, which is, what the general public doesn't seem to grasp about. Let's talk about the pandemic, for example, and the science is that many people are unable to understand that their impediment is this. They're like, how can 30,000 doctors not know what's right? Like you're telling me,
yeah, that's a common argument.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's like Dr. Setty, you're saying that Fauci is wrong and the
right.
CDC is wrong. How could that be? You've got tens of thousands of doctors that tell me something different. Because they're pushing the vaccine and they're saying don't listen to anti-vax arguments and things like this. The truth of the matter is that physicians, and with all due respect to all my colleagues, we're extremely good at following guidelines. I mean, that is how
Oh,
we've been trained. Like, this is how you treat this disease, this is how you treat that disease. Where do the guidelines come from? The guidelines come from the CDC, on many things, or the FDA, or your own institutional organizations that determine what are the appropriate steps in each particular situation, and we have become very good at following them to a T. You know,
prior to the CDC and the FDA coming into existence, um, what what was the were there guidelines then, or was it more authentic? Were doctors showing up autonomously, really doing their best to bring
well,
their expertise and their training to the situation at hand, and then following their Hippocratic oath? Because I mean, what I'm getting at, I guess, is that has the formation of agencies like the CDC and the FDA created a different kind of archetype within doctoring and within the healthcare field?
yes, they have,
Hmm.
and and look, I don't want to say that they're all useless institutions that are causing us great harm. But in Western medicine, this has been a stepwise progression towards a central organization that keeps track of what should be done. And many would say uh, and argue well for the benefit of such a centralized situation where information is shared. There are apparently experts at these in these organizations that look at the literature. We have our own professional organizations like the American Board of Anesthesia, that tell us what is the latest. What did the research say? Has it been proven? Has it been peer reviewed? Let's start to change the guidelines. So it's useful. It's extremely useful. And to answer your question, prior to the advent of these organizations, it was kind of a free for all. We didn't really know, and there would be someone in this part of the country treating a certain disease this way, not over here. So there had to be communication. We would imagine that with shared information, um, it would be we would form a better way of caring for people. However, to get back to my point, is we now have a, a body of physicians, all physicians in this country, that have forgotten how to challenge guidelines. We don't do research as clinicians. We just do what we're told. Like
Mm.
we have a great deal of experience in treating people and seeing people and knowing how to communicate, recognizing problems very early. But in general, if you veer from the guidelines that you've been told, you now expose yourself to an enormous amount of liability. Because if you don't follow, like, even if the guidelines are wrong, if you don't follow the guidelines and someone gets hurt, you have no leg to stand on. Dr. Setty, you didn't follow the CDC guidelines on this. Why did you do that? And now that person is injured. So there is the system has
So it's
evolved.
personally threatening. It's personally threatening to then not follow guidelines.
Yes.
There's a possibility that you will lose your license, that you'll lose your reputation, you'll lose your livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to go against the guidelines, no matter how illogical they may appear or be, is at great personal risk.
It's a great personal risk, which is why I will now respond to what you said. Even if they appear illogical, most physicians won't accept the fact that our guidelines are illogical. They won't. It's like, how could they be illogical? There's so many people that tell us that this is what we're supposed to do, and there is a implicit amount of trust that we place in institutions like the CDC or our own professional organizations that say this is how you do it. Like, why would we ever challenge that? And we see that the guidelines seem to work. However, in this situation with the pandemic, these guidelines, quite frankly, are absurd. When it comes
Well,
to combating the pandemic and protecting ourselves, they they uh, they should challenge even the average anesthesiologist to question what we're being told. And I'm shocked that there aren't more doctors speaking out.
hmm. I mean, what comes to mind for me, and what I think my audience would be interested to hear about, is the notion of mask wearing.
Yes.
Because from my uh, armchair research, it became apparent to me early on that, just again, with my little understanding, not having a allopathic medical background, not having gone to medical school, I don't understand molecular biology or anything like that. But at face value, it seemed as though the virus was much smaller than the spaces in between a mask, for example, and that a mask couldn't be, at least the surgical masks and so on, couldn't be, I don't know, sophisticated enough in their manufacturing to actually do what now our public health officials were claiming that they are supposed to do, given the instructions on how the general public was supposed to wear them.
Mm-hmm.
And um, so can you talk to us about that so there's a there's been a big conversation between, well, a big conversation about whether the masks work, and that's a really big question, actually, because, okay, under what mask are you talking about, under what circumstances are you talking about, what's the actual situation where the mask is being worn? So from your perspective, as somebody who's spent a number of years as your job, wearing a, a mask as a medical device, can you speak to that from your point of view?
Yes. So the way I like to answer all questions is with the recognition that um, I hope at some point there will be someone in the audience who is listening to this who is open to all possibilities. Because why should anyone believe me? It's like, yes, I'm an anesthesiologist and I've worn masks for 20 years, but there's all these other doctors saying that you have to wear masks. So why listen to Madhava Setty about this? So I always want to speak from a place of common sense, right? So that people hopefully will engage their curiosity and say, yeah, that makes sense. So um, the mask thing for me is very, very important because that is the one part of this whole pandemic response that I feel like I'm an expert on.
Mm.
Why? As you said, anesthesiologists wear masks all the time in the operating room. From the time that I was a resident, we understood what is the limitations of this medical device, and what it can do, what it cannot do. And this is backed by tons of research, which demonstrate in general when you are asymptomatic, these are well people in the operating room, it doesn't make a difference whether an anesthesiologist wears a mask or not. It makes a difference for the surgeon who is, in the field operating on someone, and the mask is a barrier to large particles both ways. Not only do you not want to sneeze into an open wound or cough into it, but you also don't want to inhale droplets of pus or blood that is coming off the field. That's why we have masks. When we, as OR healthcare providers, OR operating room, are taking care of someone with an active respiratory infection, what do? Do we wear masks? No. We know they don't work. So we take off our mask and we get on a custom fit N95 respirator that OSHA provides. Because this is the only way you can reduce the risk of getting, let's say, tuberculosis from the person that you know has tuberculosis. You have to wear an N95 mask. This thing doesn't do anything. We know that. So, so we as clinicians in the operating room should examine the mask mandates that were imposed across our country starting in March of 2020 and going right up to November, where states kept implementing mask mandates. And this is where things got very interesting for me because that was at the point where I was like waiting for the mask mandates to be rescinded. I understand that in the beginning we had no idea what we're dealing with, we need to be careful, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as we started quarantining and social distancing, that should have been enough for us to say, well, if the sick people are staying home and the well people are out and they're social distancing, there's no reason to wear a mask. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to wear a mask.
Well, and for the layperson who read labels, on the surgical mask boxes, it said does not prevent transmission or does not prevent coronaviruses or it doesn't protect from coronavirus. It says it on the box.
Yes, it says it on the box, and we know that. We as physicians should recognize that it doesn't. If, on the other hand, our government said everybody who goes outside must wear an N95 custom fit respirator, that may have some effect. Probably not outside, and probably not around asymptomatic people either. If we're quarantining sick people, that should be enough. So as the weeks progressed, and I was witnessing the lack of retraction of these mandates, that's when I started to get very more interested in how this was being handled.
Okay.
And at some point it became pretty clear that this is nonsensical, and is there another agenda behind all of this? So that's where the masks led. And in any case, I at some point I had to take it into my own hands, and I worked with another scientist to rebut the CDC's position on the efficacy of mask mandates. And we put together a paper that's out on a preprint server. And here's the point, Andrea, is that the point of our paper, if anyone's interested, we can share a link.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily, our proof. It is, again, in the absurd logic that the CDC used to make a point that masks work. It was so unscientific. There was no control group. And they offered that as, here it is, mask mandates have been associated with a reduction in cases. They never compared it. They never compared these counties to, counties that didn't have mask mandates. How can you possibly say with any, conviction that masks work if you haven't compared it to places where there were no mask mandates? And that's what we did, and we showed, the equivalent results. But this is where it becomes very interesting, and hopefully your listeners here will tune in to what's interesting here is that the lab origins hypothesis. Are we familiar with this? It's like the idea that the virus came from a virology lab and not from a wet market.
Well, it's essentially common knowledge now because of the emails that came out through the Freedom of Information Act,
Yes,
that proves that it has.
right. And what I'm pointing to here is why
Yeah,
did it take so long?
sure.
And the
It's a good
reason why it took
question.
so long is because the science itself, the scientists that are putting out studies, are distorting the data and using specious logic to make their points. And the origin of the origin thesis is in a paper in Nature Medicine that came out in March of 2020, written by someone that is becoming more and more infamous, named Christian Anderson, who works for the Scripps Institute and was one of Fauci's right hand people. And
Mm.
he was that lead author in what's now known as the Anderson paper, which is called The Proximal Origins of the SARS CoV 2 virus, which means he used his position to create a wall of scientific opinion that said it absolutely did not come from a lab. But you have to be able to look at the paper with some perspicacity as well as some understanding to recognize how he used illogical arguments to make this absurd thesis that the virus could not have come from a lab. I mean, this was out there in March of 2020 and was being disputed by experts in the field. And this is where it gets interesting, and again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, is that because mainstream media did not pick it up, it effectively was squelched. So when we hear our friends out there that keep saying trust the science, I believe in science, unless you're a scientist, you actually don't know what the scientist says, what science is saying. Just because you read the Washington Post and they tell you this is what the science says, that's not actually reading the science, people. I'm sorry. You have to actually read the study, and you have to have some uh, understanding of what the scientists are saying. And if you had the wherewithal to actually read the paper, the scientific publications that are the foundation of our position, every scientific paper talks about the limitations of the study, the uncertainty behind the conclusions, the the inability of the methodology to uncover all possibilities. Yet, when you read what mainstream media is saying about the science, it is cut and dry. Like we know this is the fact. It isn't. It really, really isn't. And if you have enough of these studies that have been demonstrated to be fallacious, we have to start throwing away our paradigm and looking at what's really happening. I'm going to be very, very direct here. I can't expect the average person in public to go and dissect a scientific publication. I can't do
Yeah,
it.
I try. I did my best to go to the original papers, and more, not being a scientist, not having training to be able to read a scientific paper, never having written one. But what I did notice was the use of probability language. So it may, it possibly, it could. And so so my background is as a linguist. So at least I could discern that, okay, well, you're not saying anything actually. You're just saying maybe. And maybe is not absolute. So it's not reality. It's a
Mhm.
possibility, but it doesn't make it reality.
You're absolutely right. I mean, every reasonable scientific publication will acknowledge the uncertainty in their conclusions and in their discussion. But the distortion occurs when that paper is being cited by the New York Times or the Washington Post
As
or
absolute.
NPR and says, a study has just showed that this happened. It's like, no, the study says it may be this, you know. So in any case, I excuse the average person. By average, I mean, a lay non-medical person
Me,
for not
yeah.
being able to go and dissect a scientific study. I have very little tolerance for my own colleagues, people who have been trained to read medical literature and question what they're being told before they do it. This is where I express frustration with members of my own field, in my ilk. We're not doing our jobs. Honestly, we're not. Especially when we have this one size fits all, vaccination uh, like all age groups, independent of the risk of getting the disease. I mean, please, like where else, my doctor friends out there, do you give the same dose to all people? Like where in medicine do you do that? We don't. Everything is dose dependent. Number one, so the one size fits all. Number one is we should be asking ourselves why are we doing that? And anyway, I could go on and on about how how many distortions are coming out of our mainstream media that they proclaim are based in science.
Well,
I believe the science.
so you alluded to a curiosity that was born as you were waiting for the mask mandates to be rescinded.
Mm-hmm.
You said that okay, there because they weren't, there must be something bigger going on. So who do you think is influencing somebody like Anderson to take that stance to create that wall of narrative?
Well, that's a it's a big question to answer, right? Because now we're going into speculation. Um,
Sure, I recognize that. I
mm-hmm.
recognize that. But we also have discernment. We also have logical minds. We also have the ability to ask questions
Mm-hmm.
and to paint a picture. So
Yes.
so let's just establish right here and now that we're entering the realm of speculation.
We're entering the realm of speculation, right? And this is something that, first of all, let us acknowledge the reason why we're entering this realm is that something isn't making sense. If everything made sense, there's no reason to speculate. But like for me, who understands mask science better than most people on this planet, and understands the dynamics of breathing, that's what we do as anesthesiologists. I was dumbfounded by the mask mandates. So that was reason enough for me to speculate. And as we'll see here, like the pandemic itself, it's hard to challenge what what is happening unless you can put the pandemic itself into a greater context. And it so happens that at the time, as this pandemic was unfolding on our planet, I was writing a book about the bigger context. The book is called "Woke: An Anesthesiologist's View." Oh, that's so wonderful! Where did you get that?
You gave it to me.
I don't give those out for free.
You even wrote in it.
I wrote a whole. Oh, look at that! Oh, that was pretty of you. It's very, very difficult for a person who has never challenged what these mainstream media sources have said their whole life to now be brought to a place where their friends are saying, hey, well, maybe we should, think about what we're being told and ask deeper questions. And for most people, it's like, why should I ask a deeper question? This is the National Public Radio telling me this. This is Anthony Fauci, the head of the NIAID. Um, you know, so anyway, having uh, being forced to speculate is something that we have to do, that we're being compelled to do. There's a bigger context, and so your question was, who is potentially forming the narrative, a false narrative around masks, for example, or the pandemic? Well, or as you said, Christian Anderson. Like, who's doing it? Well, we have pretty good, indirect evidence that it's Fauci and Jamie Farrar. Jamie Farrar is the head of the Wellcome Trust in the UK, which is sort of the Gates Foundation of England. He has a $26 billion endowment, and he therefore has a lot of control over what research gets done and these things like this. So, and the reason why I say we have some evidence is that from FOIA, and we looked at Fauci's emails. It is very clear that in January of 2020, there was some concern in those upper circles that the virus may have leaked. And Fauci called upon Christian Anderson to examine the virus itself. Are there signs that it could have been manipulated by human hand? And Anderson responded, well, in order to see that it was potentially manipulated, you have to look really, really closely. So that's a very guarded statement. He's basically saying, he's not saying that it was manipulated,
Right.
but he's saying that there may be some truth that the fact that it may have been manipulated, but you have to look really hard. That's what his statement was.
Mhm.
And in that same email, he says, well, I and my colleagues have come to a general consensus that it was probably, it doesn't look like it was a product of natural evolution. That is in one email that we have. And, to all of you folks out there, very sensitive discussions about these topics probably didn't happen through email. Let's be real. Like, you're not going to, Fauci is not going to send an email that would incriminate him to a bunch of people because he knows that will be discoverable at some point. So we yet nonetheless we have this interesting email. 5 weeks later, right before the proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2 got published in Nature Medicine, Christian Anderson writes a letter to Fauci and to Jamie Farrar and the head of the NIH, whose name is escaping me right now, saying, "Okay, it's going to be published. Thank you for your guidance and leadership in this paper." And this is the paper that used ridiculous logic to prove that it did not come from a lab. So we have to understand something, like, to the general public here, is that Fauci has never taken care of a patient with COVID-19. He's a bureaucrat in charge of billions of dollars of resources. Um, and why would what kind of leadership, honestly, would Fauci be able to give to a medical researcher, like one of the top researchers in the world, with a team of experts that are trying to dissect, whether this virus came from nature or not? He doesn't have any, authority to override, these people. So we have to assume then that Anderson and Ian Lipkin and his team of virologists were impelled to write a paper like this. I mean, that's what makes sense. The fact of the matter is that the paper is bunk, and they're too good of they're they're too good at what they do to have written a paper like that. And then they acknowledged their higher ups, the Fauci and the authorities, for saying thank you for helping us write this paper. So that the the crux of the matter here's the morsel for the audience, is that even the science is being distorted by the scientists themselves now. This is proof that even the science itself is not objective and not fair, which puts us in an incredibly dangerous position. Who are we supposed to trust if you can't trust a scientist? I'm not saying don't trust any scientist. I'm saying that it's possible that the data and the opinion gets manipulated.
Well, it also puts a whole new spin on the initiative to get this COVID uh, shot, this injection, this experimental pharmaceutical product into arms. Because if if this if they were having these conversations early on, then there's no benevolent reason to get behind that biological push, the push to get this biological experiment into arms.
Mm-hmm.
Now it makes them criminals um, so what would the logic be to put another biological experiment on top of another biological experiment? It's like insult to injury. and
Yes.
and what we now know through hindsight, as news is being revealed, is that it's causing injury. To your point, there's no one size that fits all in medicine, and it seems that younger populations are really um, fragile or vulnerable rather to adverse events to the injectable through there's injury to the heart, immune injury, neurological injury. In fact, just this morning I was listening to a Senate hearing. I think it was Senator Johnson. He had set up a Senate hearing so that there were people from the community of all walks of life who could share their experience um, with with injury, with having been harmed from receiving the shot. So to me, it makes now the push to, it just puts a whole other spin on the push to get this vaccine out.
This is where I think it's useful to take the position of a devil's advocate or someone who's skeptical of a conspiracy or ulterior motive, right? And we would have to acknowledge. I'm going to play that role right now. I'm going to be the the person who claims to be completely objective and believes there could not be a nefarious agenda or something else. Here's what I would know. Number one,
Maybe not nefarious, but irresponsible, or irresponsible. That so the train has left the station, and there's not. So let's say they were ignorant. The train's left the station,
yes,
in
I'm
terms
what I'm
of
saying.
the production of the vaccine, and so now it's like, okay, well, we've got to get it into arms. We've already spent billions. We've got the infrastructure. We have a product. We just need to offload it now. It could be as simple as that. It could be an industry question.
Correct. I'm
Yeah.
saying I'm going to play the role of someone who wants to believe in the system. Okay. Even so, I would have to acknowledge that the virus has been the product of human ingenuity. I mean, it's obvious that that's where it came from. Okay. Now, because I trust the system, I'll say, well, look, you know, uh, gain of function research is a necessary component of protecting the society because we know that people can do this, so we have to study pathogens so that we know how to make ourselves immune to them. So we'll give them that. It's like, okay, I excuse you, Fauci, for funding Peter Daszak and Eco Health Alliance. Okay, so you had to do the research because you thought that you were doing the right thing. But now we have to acknowledge the fact that there has been a cover up. Like he tried to not let people know that this was a viable, a much more viable theory from where it came from. Why is that? And how do we know that's happening? Well, he's acknowledging that it probably did. And he basically dismissed anyone for the last 15 months that said it came from a lab. Yet we know that he has acknowledged that it's a very likely possibility from the very beginning. So now we have a little bit of doubt about his integrity. Now, let us say then that it got created in a lab, which we all can understand, and now it's escaped into our ecosphere. So we need to do something to help people. Let's start working on a vaccine. Great. Start the vaccine. Start the research. Talk about this emergency use authorization. Whatever it takes to save the people. Why then would the CDC and the FDA not look at things like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin? If your intent is to protect people, and we have uh, irrefutable evidence that ivermectin is a miracle drug against COVID, not simply for someone who is sick from COVID, but as a prophylaxis against getting COVID. This is as good as a vaccine. It's as good. It would be better than the best flu vaccine we've ever made against the flu. It's about 85% effective. If you're taking ivermectin every couple of weeks, it's better than getting a vaccine if you're trying to prevent the flu from a flu vaccine. So it's a great treatment, but they didn't acknowledge it. And this gets back to, what we said about guidelines. If they don't put it on their guidelines, then any physician that prescribes ivermectin is now jumping off the tracks. What if that person dies? What if something happens to that person? Well, the physician now has no grounds to stand on because Fauci did not, or the CDC did not put it on their guidelines. And we have, like well published experts in the field like Pierre Corey, Um, Paul Merritt, they've been saying, please at least acknowledge it so we can get this out to doctors to help people. And they didn't do it. So even from a conspiratorial skeptic, you still have to acknowledge that number one, they tried to hide the fact that it came from a lab, and number two, they refused to acknowledge therapies that could have helped hundreds of thousands of people. So this is inescapable. Now we get down. Now the vaccine started to get rolled out, right? And here's where we have to be not have a double standard. These adverse events are popping up all over the place, right? And the argument now is like, oh well, it's you don't have a reliable system of reporting. It's VAERS. It's self-reporting. People cannot attribute a outcome to the vaccine itself. It has to be researched, and we don't know. Well, hold on a second. That's the same system we used to monitor how safe flu vaccines and other vaccines have been in the past, right? What are we supposed to do when our VAERS system is literally off the charts right now?
Yeah.
30 times more than a typical flu season. There's more vaccine related injuries or alleged vaccine related injuries than, the decades worth of vaccines, all vaccines. Like, how big a signal do you need to hear before you'll stop and say, whoa, wait a second, maybe there's a mistake? And so, for those skeptics out there, I would say, tell me what it would take for you to get on board and say, maybe we should pause. What exactly would it take? Remember that the people who report to VAERS are not anti vax. These are people that actually, acceded to the vaccine itself. Why would they be making stuff up?
Right.
And go and try to register a adverse event in VAERS. Go try. It's not that easy.
Mm.
It's not something that you can get on your computer and inject the system with 500 fake accounts. It's not so easy to do.
Mm.
So let's discount anti-vaxxers out there filing um, reports. There's a signal. It's not perfect. It's VAERS, and it is sounding alarms, left and right, like thousands and thousands of uh, adverse events, hundreds of thousands of adverse events. Furthermore, here's another piece of irrefutable evidence, right? Uh, the skeptics about the alternative narrative say, well, you can't attribute, myocarditis or Bell's palsy or, clots or I feel bad to the vaccine because these things can occur spontaneously. Okay, granted, I'll give you that. What about anaphylaxis? Anaphylaxis is a life-threatening situation. It's an acute allergic response that creates a cascade of events that puts someone into cardiovascular collapse and respiratory compromise. The blood pressure goes away, they can't breathe. I've attended to people with anaphylaxis. It's no joke. It is scary. And thankfully, I've never lost a person to anaphylaxis, but it happens. And here's where we can be very objective. What is the risk of anaphylaxis of a flu vaccine? We know that. It's about 1.3 in a million. We accept that as, the risk you take when getting a vaccine. You may go into anaphylaxis. What is it with the COVID-19 vaccines? Well, the CDC themselves acknowledge that it's about 2 to 11 in a million. So right away we're saying, well, the COVID vaccine has a higher rate of anaphylaxis. It's still very low. Let's say it's like 5 or 6 per million. Is that the real number? It isn't. We have much better data because that's from the VAERS system. If you look at the study that came out in JAMA a few months ago that has to do with the Mass General and Brigham system here in Boston, who inoculated over 60,000 of their providers and healthcare workers with either Pfizer or Moderna, and questioned them, what was your experience? They got 52,000 responses. Of those 52,000 people, 16 of them had documented anaphylaxis. 16
Wow.
out of 52,000. That's 247 out of a million
Wow.
with the COVID vaccine. This is undeniable. So the vaccine, the COVID 19 vaccine, is about 200 times more likely to give you anaphylaxis. I'm not saying that's a reason why no one should get the vaccine, but let us acknowledge what we know before discounting the fact that there could be a problem. This is undeniable evidence that it's not what we're being told. So, so the evidence keeps mounting that there's a problem, and why is it that we're unable to acknowledge the fact that we're dealing with something completely different? Are we dealing with something completely different? Yes, we are. We've never made a vaccine like this and inoculated, hundreds of millions of people with something that we think might do what we expect it to do. And as physicians and people in the medical care industry is like, yeah, the reason why trials take forever is that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't, like, we think it's going to work one way, and then 2 years later we find out, like, oh my god, we totally made a mistake with that. We shouldn't have been giving it. Why is it, honestly, that we are moving ahead full speed without acknowledging the fact that we really have no idea how this is going to turn out? And now it goes back to the masks. What was the ulterior motive to the masks? If there was one, I'm speculating. We know that they don't work. It's been proven now. We should have known it all along. But undeniably, we can say that going out into the world where everybody is masked has a psychological effect. I mean, let's be real here. Like, yes, maybe it saves one in a million people. I don't know, but when you're out there and you see masks, like, how is your mind not going to go immediately to, holy cow, it's dangerous to be out here. Everyone's wearing a mask. This is so odd. So that undeniably has an effect on how we perceive what our situation is. Should we be afraid? It certainly seems that way. Now people without a mask on are a threat. And in the past, everyone who had a mask on was, either out on the wrong day for Halloween or robbing a bank. So, like, what is happening here? We're changing our whole perspective. So the mask stuff is having an effect. And again, I'm speculating. Like, could this be the reason? Perhaps. Especially in lieu of the entire set of undeniable aspects to our pandemic response, it doesn't make sense. Like, what we're doing is not making sense.
Mm. So it's time to wrap up, and I'm so grateful for this conversation. I think it's going to be enlightening and intriguing for a lot of people. So, one final thought that you have for people navigating this climate. We're in a pivotal time. We're in history in the making. What would you like to impart for people within, yes, how to navigate this climate?
Well, uh, perhaps the most important thing that I would impart would be for all of us who recognize that there's a danger happening here, and we're subjecting ourselves to danger, is recognize that the people who are resistant to our message regard us as an existential threat to them. Okay, so you have to remember that when you come at someone and say that they're misinformed or they're asleep or they're a sheep or believe my study and not yours, recognize that you are a threat to them. So you have to be very, very careful with your messaging. Um, Screaming out that you know better than they or your sources are better than theirs is not going to work. It isn't. So Andrea, you yourself are an excellent example of maintaining your composure while expressing your belief systems. And for all of you out there, go, if you're not friends with Andrea on Facebook, look at how she manages those who are strenuously in disagreement with her.
Mm.
That, sadly, is what we're being called to do. We have to hold ourselves to a much higher standard than this diatribe that's coming from mainstream. So, if you're truly interested in moving the needle towards clarity, you have to take on a greater responsibility in the way you express yourself, and more compassion for them, because even though you know that you're not a threat, they think you are.
Yeah.
What you think makes your reality. And finally, I would suggest, rather than scurrying through the internet to find a study that backs up your position, look more at what studies they use to back up their position. Okay, because right away, you run into a problem when you offer something to somebody else that you believe in, and it's very easy for them to find some way of discounting it. It's like, well, I found some other source that says the person who wrote that is a conspiracy theorist or believes in 9/11, or whatever. They can easily discount what you give to them. Go to their source, find out what the limitations are of that study, and dismember it, and take it apart and show them, like, look, you're jumping to conclusions based on a lot of uncertainty here. And more often than not, the studies that back up what we're doing are very flawed, and they're out there. But you have to make the effort, and using the amount of inquiry that they do is not going to be enough. You have to crank it up a notch, several.
Yeah, I think for me, what has been surprising is that somehow early on, I had a strong conviction that I wanted nothing to do with this narrative, and it was from the beginning. Um, Somehow, right from the beginning, I was wise to it. So it was surprising to me to see that others weren't.
Mm.
And so then I wanted to show them my point of view, to show them the other possibility. But more, what I'm really trying to share is that I was just simply shocked that others didn't have the same conviction, natural conviction that I had. And then I thought, okay, well, I understand it because I'm a natural healing practitioner. My point of view is non-invasive preventative care, prophylactic, early intervention. um,
Mm-hmm.
so one of the first instructions that came down early on, so what was it, like, March of last year, was, if you're not feeling well, take a Tylenol, go home and wait. And so I knew something was egregiously wrong for that to be the public health direction. Because from our perspective, from a natural healing perspective, that's the worst advice that you can give to somebody. No, it's prophylactic and early intervention is the medicine, is the way
Mm-hmm.
to cure, because you're curing because it won't become anything. So what I've come to learn is that um, it's more that my conviction comes from a place of clarity. So I have a very clear idea about how healing and health looks to me, looks like, smells like, sounds like, tastes like, whereas others don't have such clarity. So all that's really happening, if I were to take a step back and just look at this uh, from a broader view, not from such a personal view, is to say that all that's happening is that there are some who have um, a clear idea, and there are those who somehow don't have a clear idea about what health and healing looks like. So
Mm-hmm.
so for me, what's born out of my conviction is me taking action steps to keep going and creating the world that I want to see. And then naturally, the people who don't have the clarity are coming from from their point of view and taking action based on their point of view. So their point of view may be of a lack of knowledge, uncertainty, fear, and so they're going to be creating a reality from that place. And that's really all that's happening. And that's where the rubbers met the road here, between the two sides. So I think, I don't know if that's helpful to bring some compassion, um, and also to make it less personal. Um,
Mm. Well, look, I know we're wrapping up here, but I want to acknowledge what you said there, because um, you said something interesting, and you kept saying it, which is clarity, um, and not truth. And that's an important distinction to make. as we enter these conversations with our friends and not so friendly people is that there is this mantra about truth. You know, speak your truth, believe your truth. I believe in truth. It's like, hold on a second. People believe in different things. Like, just simply saying that what you believe is the truth is a great way to just shut down a conversation. So, that being the case, you use clarity, right? Now, what is to keep someone from shutting you down? It's like, why should I believe you, Andrea? You know, you're a natural healer, but there's 10,000 doctors out there saying you're wrong, and you're claiming clarity. How can you be claiming clarity? And so, what I would suggest here is that the mark of clarity is this: if you are, the more clarity you have, the more you're willing to openly look at both arguments. Um, this has to be a sign of clarity. If you believe you're absolutely clear and you have more clarity than Andrea or me, why then will you not look at the opposing view? Because that isn't clarity, my friends. That is obstinance,
Mm.
honestly, and it's the lack of clarity that makes you think that, well, anybody who challenges my opinion must be off their rocker. That's not clarity. Clarity is being objective and saying, I'm going to look at both sides. And when you look at both sides, it's pretty clear that what we're being told is not true.
Right.
And so I would implore all of your listeners to say, don't talk about truth, don't talk about science, but talk about it in terms of clarity. Like, how clear can we get on this? And that's let's not forget, this is a religion. Mainstream media is a religion to people. It is our guardian against tyranny,
Hmm.
right? So it's not easy for them to challenge it. It would be like, you might be able to challenge your friend who is, say, a Christian about, like, do you really believe in a judgment day and, the pearly gates and St. Peter and all this stuff? Well, I don't know, maybe not. You're right, there is some certainty. What if their mom just died and they believe they're going to heaven? And then you question their whole belief system around, let's say, heaven itself. They're going to shut you down. Like, they don't want to hear that. Well, that's what's happening right now with mainstream media. People don't understand the science. So now mainstream media has been their way of, without knowing the science, someone please tell me what the science says. Will someone please
Right.
tell me? Boom. There you have the Washington Post saying, this is what the science says. Do you think they're going to question the Washington Post when there's a global pandemic? No, they won't. It takes a rare, rare person who may have the clarity that you have or the clarity that I have to question them. It's like questioning your scripture on the day that your parent died. It's not going to
Right.
happen, or at least we have to understand that it's hard for that person to let go of that. That's what I would like to leave you with.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think what was coming up to me as you were speaking was that the clarity comes from a moral and ethical conviction based on my worldview. Um, that's what gives me my certainty and the clarity.
Mm.
So thank you, Madhava. I'm so grateful for our time.
And good luck, and thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you, honey. So I'll see you soon.
All right, bye bye.
Bye.